All right, we are at the half hour now, so we can start just some of our housekeeping notes for folks. Welcome everybody who has joined us already, 40 folks right on time, very impressed. So just for folks who are here, couple housekeeping notes. So please feel welcome to ask questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. And this will help us keep track of questions and try to answer them in order. So please use that function. You do have access to the chat as well. That's just going to be a little harder for us to keep eyes on. But if you need to reach out to the hosts or, with any technical questions, or if you just have a comment that you want to share, maybe a link, you can use the chat. But just know that if you want to ask a question, oh, thank you, Janet. Janet has said chat is disabled. Give me one moment, I will fix that. While we're waiting for folks to arrive here. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Janet. So it looks like attendees now, you can use the chat function. But again, if you have a question that you want us to cover in the Q&A portion of the presentation, please use the Q&A function. All right. Also, if you're having any technical difficulties, send a message to the host through the chat function. We do know sometimes people don't hear the audio correctly. There's a little kind of permissions thing you might have to enable in your browser if you're having an issue hearing audio. All right. Okay, so we've had some time for folks to arrive. We've got 50 folks. I think we can get started in the interest of time. And yeah, all right. Great. Welcome everybody to this Mapbox webinar. I am your host, Marina Smith from the Mapbox marketing team and social impact function at Mapbox. I am joined by a panel of special guests today to discuss how their organizations are using maps and location technologies to support climate action. This is in honor, of course, of Earth Day coming up, but more generally, a very pressing topic that we see our customer base and our general community very, very interested in. So thank you for joining us today. We have Gabriella Volpato, who is a product manager with WattTime and a data manager with the Climate Trace Coalition. We have Rahul Misra, the head of carbon product and operations at CarbonCure, and Riaz Jahangir, the engineering manager at NCX, which stands for the Natural Capital Exchange. So thank you so much for joining me today, all three of our guests. In our 45 minutes together, we will start with some quick context on Mapbox for folks who maybe you haven't heard of Mapbox before, but then we'll roll right over into having each of our guests provide a short summary of the work that they're doing and how maps and location are part of that. Then I've got a series of questions for our panel to discuss, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So your Q&A questions for that portion of the presentation are very welcome. All right, so first off, if you have not heard of Mapbox before, just a little bit of context on why Mapbox is hosting this exciting webinar. So Mapbox is the location platform for applications for web and mobile that need to use mapping, navigation. Maybe you're doing data visualization on maps like a lot of our folks here today. It's a modular architecture, so you could, any developer, any company, any organization can build a tailored location intelligent application. And you can put your own data on it. You can have it work across different platforms. It's a suite of developer tools that folks can use in a very flexible range of ways. And really, it's the stories of our customers and what they build that illuminate the potential of the Mapbox platform. And that's why we love to host conversations like this with NCX, CarbonCure, and Climate Trace to share in more detail about how they are using this Mapbox tech stack to further their mission and their impact. So to get us started, let's learn a little bit more about each of our guests, starting with Gabby from Climate Trace, and then we'll roll over to NCX and CarbonCure. So Gabby, could you kick us off, give us a little overview of what Climate Trace is all about?
Yeah, sure. First of all, hi everyone, morning, depending on where you are. I'm very glad to be here and talking to you all about Climate Trace. So thanks everyone like for joining. A little bit more like about Climate Trace. We are a coalition of like nonprofits and organizations and other organizations as well, like universities and a lot of like other collaborators. Where like our main goal, like in Climate Trace, is to be an independent tool that like tracks like greenhouse gases emissions from like different sources and like in different like sectors, and mostly like having like a comprehensive like emissions inventories. Rena, could you just like play the video on this one? Here, like I'm just showing a little bit more about like our Climate Trace like platform. And this is like all freely available. So like if you go to Google climatetrace.org, it will find us, where we have like mapped a lot of like our emissions sources, and you can choose like different sectors where it's being shown there. Here I'm just showing like a little bit more of like the our heavy industry like sectors. And if you go there, you can like look at like all of our different sources of emissions. Here, like some in China, so traveling there a little bit more and making like visible the invisible of like the emissions where they are located, and mostly like who are responsible for that. You can also filter by like the country location, and then like still like going there and interacting with like the platform, where we are showing like all the different like sources from like heavy industry within like the US. Yeah, like the user can like always like select where like which like sectors, all of our different like sectors, picking like different things that we like sources that we have, like different sources here, and interact with them and seeing like where like all of what our emissions numbers, and bringing that like more back to where they're coming from, and seeing that like in a map, like more like in a visual way. Yeah, so that's like just a very like short like demo of like our like Climate Trace, and like how we're presenting like our emissions data in the map, and like making like easier to users, and like having like climate actions to see where like those emissions are coming from.
I dropped a link as well in the chat for folks who want to go explore that site live. Thank you,
Thank
Gabby. Riaz, can you tell us a little bit about, there we go. A little bit more about the Natural Capital Exchange.
Yeah, for sure. So NCX partners with companies looking to achieve their own most important sustainability goals of all kinds. And we connect these companies with forest landowners to develop different kinds of nature positive projects that not only have climate impact, but have ecological and local community impact as well. So we do tree planting, improved forest management type projects, biodiversity projects, and we use a lot of maps. So thanks, Marina, to you and to Mapbox for hosting this event.
Great. And finally, Rahul, could you tell us about Carbon Cure?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Rahul. Likewise, thank you for having us, and excited to be here. So Carbon Cure is a carbon removal and reduction company centered around the concrete industry. So this is important because concrete is, as you saw in Gabby's presentation, there's a lot of those heavy emitters tend to be in the concrete supply chain. And so our technology, what we do is we take captured CO2 and we allow concrete producers to inject that CO2 through the use of our technology into the concrete manufacturing process. This CO2, when it's injected, it actually is permanently mineralized within that material. So it's locked away forever. So you're taking it out of the atmosphere and you're permanently ensuring that it's never re-released back into the atmosphere, which is an important part of one of the important climate solutions that we have that we need to scale up. But then that mineralization activity actually also creates a strength benefit within the material. This benefit allows you to use less cement in the production of the same concrete product. So we're actually both reducing that emissions profile of concrete, and we're also creating this massive carbon sink for captured CO2. And we use maps. This is an example of one of the stories that we've told with Mapbox. We use maps primarily to make the invisible visible, as I think Gabby said. We're talking about the absence really of an invisible gas with a lot of what our business does, and to make that more visceral for people, maps is a critically important tool.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was excited to have the trio of you here together because it tells such an interesting arc about climate and greenhouse gas emissions in general. Where are they coming from? The sources of Climate Trace, and then ways to capture it, ways to reduce emissions with CarbonCure and NCX. Okay, so my first question actually is for Riaz and Gabby, and it's all about measurement. I'm struck by a phrase that NCX uses, that you can't measure or you can't manage what you can't measure. So both Gabby and Riaz, your work revolves so much around data and measurement, collecting it, verifying data, applying and visualizing data in a way that makes it useful. How do maps support you in this complex data work? Let's start with Riaz.
Yeah, you can't manage what you can't measure. That's so true. Data in general plays such a huge role in our ability to, facilitate this nature positive change that we're trying to make. At NCX, we have quite a few different data sources, and maps are kind of a natural asset to visualize them because, like, everything we're looking at has a geospatial component to it, right? The data that we're collecting is about land that exists on the surface of the planet. So it's kind of intuitive to be able to see where and what that looks like. So I'll talk a little bit about what this slide is showing, but in general, first, like, just kind of what goes into our workflow. There's satellite imagery that we typically start with. The NASA and USGS here in America have Landsat. European Space Agency has Sentinel-2. So there's different satellite systems that have slightly different specs and do different things, but ultimately capture images of the ground. In forestry specifically, we have FIA, the Forest Inventory and Analysis Database, and that'll tell you things like the size and species of trees on the ground, harvest activity, the health status of different things. And so government agencies that provide these services are really invaluable for us. There's lots more acronyms. There's NLCD, the National Land Cover Database, and that'll tell you, like, is this area water? Is it grassland, forest land? Is it an urban development? Is it a city? And so, there's that and lots more that goes into it. And at the very end of this, our very talented data team is able to provide a whole bunch of information for a single pixel, like one square here, and you can kind of see the pixelation on the right side zoomed in. But that's like a 30 meter by 30 meter pixel of the Earth. And, by the time it kind of comes out of this data pipeline, we know so much about that. We know, here in this slide, we're using a different primary color to kind of show the different species. So I can't read it offhand, but one of them is like conifers, one of them is oak and hickory, and then the other one is like just other hardwood species. And just looking at this at a glance, you can immediately see that the composition of trees on, like, the Northern California coast is very different from the composition of trees further inland, right? You can just see that by the color. And so, maps are an easy way to see things like that, right? So, once you get these pixels of information together, you can say, hey, I can see there's an area of the Earth here, or here's a state that has a lot of reforestation potential, or here's another area that has very mature forests and is acting as a great carbon sink. And so those kinds of insights become so much easier when it's not like a table full of numbers and it's actually, colors on a map. And on the landowner side, when people are signing up to work with us on a project, one of the first things they do is they get presented with a Mapbox map. Actually, it's powered by Mapbox GLJS, and they're able to do an address search and locate their property on that map and say, okay, here's where I live. What am I good for? Like, what kinds of projects would be good for me? And so we can join up what they've shown us, what they've provided with pixelations like this data that we've already collected about the United States. And join that up and say, okay, well, this particular landowner, they've got, good potential for tree planting, or maybe they've got forest land that could benefit from a biodiversity project.
That's a huge amount of data to make accessible like this. And I love that you built that into your onboarding for new landowners as well, to kind of just see what you see when they're evaluating their land and when you're intaking them into the platform.
Yeah.
How about you, Gabby? In terms of ways that you're using data and how maps support you in the complex, massive data work that Climate Trace is all about?
Yeah, so like us in Climate Trace, we provided like a comprehensive inventory, greenhouse gas emissions inventories. And like the traditional way, like where other like even like countries or provinces or states, they have like providing like these greenhouse gas inventories are usually in the spreadsheet. So you have like the sector and then the total amount of like the emissions that are occurring. But one of the things that like we're trying to do like within like Climate Trace is not like showing the comprehensive like what are the aggregated totals, but like showing where like all of like single, as I showed in a demo, every like single sources that we can estimate emissions are, like where they're located, and trying like to bring that like more like humanize that like data instead of like being presented like in a spreadsheet where you could have like the name of the city. We can like show where that like asset is located and which like city it is close by, who are like potentially like the communities can be like impacted by that like source being close by. So that's like something that like other like storytelling that we would like to show. Also like the powerfulness like of like us showing that like, oh, there are like there are a lot of like cement industries like in Asia, or a lot of like manufacturing like happening in the US. You can kind of see like the distribution of like those sources as well. And that's like a very like impactful and powerful like messaging, especially when we're starting like to talk to potential users. And then instead of like presenting like the data in a spreadsheet or like just a graph, we can show like, hey, like these are like the point sources that we are like estimating emissions for. Like we use like these like satellite images to estimate the emissions for them. And this is like where they're located. And this is like what we are saying. Of course, like we don't like try to like present our data as like the final truth, but like more like an inviting way, like let's discuss, like, is this like the location that we found like correct? How can we like improve our data as well? So the main like bottom line is just like it helps to break the ice instead of like just showing like in a graph, but like showing where they are actually like happening and the impact that it could be done.
I like that you touched on so many different stages of that data work as well. You're using geospatial tools in the actual creation and collection of the data, the verification with the community and having folks be able to look at it intuitively. And then also, to your point, kind of inspiring questions, inspiring further analysis of that data. But I definitely agree. It's a lot more inviting to start with a visual, like the map, and then dig into the nitty gritty of the data science.
Yeah.
Well, continuing on that thread about storytelling and communication of data, I've got a question for Rahul and Riaz. Measurement and traceability are also very core to CarbonCure's work, as they are with NCX. So I'm interested in how you've applied all of this data and the geospatial data that you've collected to help explain the technology, explain the transformations involved in concrete carbon capture. And with Riaz, the transforming the data into a narrative that is accessible and exciting for your audiences. So how are you using maps to communicate, and how is this different maybe from other formats that you would use to communicate? Can we start with Rahul?
Yeah, of course. So I should have mentioned before, but one of the main areas we use maps and sort of try to spell out the journey that a CO2 molecule takes is with regards to the carbon credits that we generate. So that's actually the team that I'm responsible for. Is when we use our technology, or when our concrete producers use our technology, it provides a very data-rich stream of information that's coming to our databases, and we're able to package that up into carbon credits. We then bring these carbon credits to the voluntary carbon market and sell those to buyers. We then return that revenue back to producers to create this sort of flywheel effect. So where maps really come in storytelling for us is communicating to buyers what is actually happening. So we have, we're in 700 plants around the world. What we're doing at one plant is very different if it's happening on the West Coast of the United States versus if it's happening in Singapore. Where they're getting the CO2 from is very different. Where that concrete is actually being poured in the world is very different. So part of what we try to do is really bring that granularity to the forefront when we're having these conversations with credit buyers, and letting them understand, maybe they're based in Chicago. We want to show them, hey, this is carbon removal. This is activity that's happening in your backyard. It's not necessarily happening halfway around the globe, although that might be the case too. But it really allows them to kind of conceptualize the whole end-to-end process. And as far as credits go, it is really a glorified spreadsheet. That's what we're talking about. It's numbers in columns on an Excel that we get audited, and that proves that, hey, this is actually happening. But really, I think what humans want is that storytelling. You want to understand that you're a part of this chain of events, and you're helping make that occur. And we've really seen maps be very useful in creating that imagery and letting people understand, like, oh, this is where the CO2 came from there, and they drove on the freeway that I take to work every day, and it ended up at this concrete plant that I drive by all the time, and it's sitting in my son's school, today as the bus lane or something like that. We try to make it very, very visceral to people, and I think we've seen it be very, very helpful.
I love that relatability of the Carbon Cure story, right? It is so it can be so hyper local in terms of knowing exactly, oh, my carbon credits are here in that building, and being able to tell that story spatially. It's a great fit. Mm-hmm. How about you, Riaz? How have you been using storytelling for NCX?
Yeah, like as Rahul was saying, I think it's so powerful to be able to, make things feel real. I think websites as a medium in general give us, so much power to communicate nowadays. And I think, journalism as an industry is a really great industry to look at for how to tell stories well, and how to, best convey really dense subject matter potentially to the wider public. So the New York Times actually does this really well. 4 years ago, this month, actually, I think there was the fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, and the Times had put out this, like, one of the first examples I'd seen of this scrolly telling concept. So you kind of scroll through, and it's it's a story that weaves together traditional text, photos, video, and like animated diagrams and 3D models of the Notre Dame and maps, and it all weaves together in this really engaging way that tells the story in a way that can only be done on the web, right? And pictures are better than words, and videos are better than pictures, but like these kind of interactive visualizations, I think are even better than video, right? Like they allow the user, the person reading it, to be like an active participant in the story. They can go at their own pace, and they're just naturally more engaged in it. So here on this slide is one of our sites, story.ncx.com. And incidentally, this is based heavily on Mapbox's interactive storytelling template. And it tells the story of how, like, forest carbon projects are able to sequester more carbon on the landscape. And as the user scrolls through, the background map stays static, but the layers that we are able to display on the map kind of change depending on the context of what we're telling in the story. And then on the next slide, you'll see our impact dashboard. And there's a lot here. It's impact.ncx.com. This is just one page of the overall dashboard site. But this one's really cool. There's a lot going on, but I wanted to kind of draw your attention to the bottom right where the actual map is. And that map shows these 4 core habitat areas that are outlined in orange for this particular species, the coastal martin. Endangered, only 500 of them left. And the story that we're telling here, and like each of those white bullets on the map actually progresses through different text and different layers being shown on the map. So if you actually go to the site, you can see this interactively. But the yellow areas are called habitat corridors, and they essentially connect. It's forest land that connects the main habitat cores. So for this species to have a healthy population and to be able to survive, it needs to be able to move through these corridors into these main cores to kind of maintain a healthy population. And the crux of this is that within those corridors is private forest landowners, right? And it's people. This isn't all just like public land in a national park somewhere. This is acreage that people own and have power to take action on. So the end result, the story here is that if people choose to take on improved forest management practices or biodiversity projects explicitly, we can do a better job for this coastal martin here that we're looking at, and maps make that an easy story to tell.
And I do encourage people to go check out the page at impact.ncx.com. It's beautiful, beautifully done dashboard, and communications is kind of a nice blend of data visualization, kind of like a data viz portal with that kind of guided storytelling feel. I think it's a really nice blend, Riaz. All right, well, so next question here for Gabby and Rahul. I'm struck, all three of you engage industry in different ways, but in particular, I'd like to talk about how Gabby, you and Rahul are engaging major industrial and commercial players in the emissions landscape. Sometimes maybe putting pressure on them with Climate Trace, exposing some visibility in terms of who the big emitters are, but also inviting them to help build solutions. So how does working from a data-driven, map-driven approach, one that champions transparency and storytelling, how is that helping you work with companies in your work? Maybe let's start with Gabby.
That's a great question. And it is like one that like we ask ourselves like every day, like especially like when we're like building like our platform. Mostly because like we deal with like a broad spectrum of like users. There are like some users that are very technical. They're like ready to dig into the data, and all they want is like the data. Like just give me access like to the data. I'm not gonna look like much like what do you have there. And that's like very technical folks, but that they are like okay and they're good at like more familiar with exploring and doing like a lot of like data manipulation. But like once we were starting like engaging, we we're like talking, like speaking with like companies, we are like we are like facing like either folks that don't have the time to do a lot of that like data digging, or they are like more like concerned of like just like understanding and getting like more the broad like picture, but so like not very like technical in terms of like data manipulation. And a lot of like these folks that we were talking about, there are a lot of like, as we know, we have like been like talking, like being warning by like scientists that we like must cut like emissions by like 45% by 2030. And there are like companies and users that come to us and say like how can I do this? Like help me like be part of like this cause of like decreasing emissions. And when we were talking about emissions, like they're like usually like at something abstract or just like numbers. Although like when we're presenting the data, like the emissions data, either like our forestry data in a map where we can show that like these are the areas that are like happening like some deforestation. These are like the areas where like there are like some mining or like power plants that are located. Those like they help like to, as I mentioned before, like either like break the ice and help like to explore and dig more like into the data itself, and like having like more like locations. Also, like one of the things that like has helped us a lot with like working with company is all the transparency. Is like us like showing these are the assets and locations. Assets, I keep saying, like sources of emissions that like we know about. These are the ones that we don't know about, and presenting the data as in a way that like this is not the final truth, but like in an abiding way to collaborate with us. And that has helped either like to build like a win-win, like collaboration, like for both of us. One of like the recent projects that we have worked where it was like not with companies necessarily, but like with the governments, 6 like province governments, where they were trying to understand more about like their emissions inventory and presenting the data in a map, where like the road map, like the for like road transportation, which like cities we included in our inventory was like very helpful to understand like both like numbers as well. Mm-hmm. And the storytelling, it's all about like the storytelling, presenting the data in a way that it's invites users to look more through, and then that invites like more conversations about like how we can do like some impactful action. One other thing that like we started like exploring as well, it's more like about like the supply chain and like managers side, mostly because of like our like heavy industry data, where like some like supply chain managers, they can see where like all of the production of those goods they are happening, but they can also like bring into like question if the good is purchased from this area instead of that one, how would that like impact like emissions overall? Like how does that like the transportation of that good is going to be impacted? Can I do something that like if I switch from A to B, that would like help to decrease emissions? So like all of these, like presenting the data like in a map, inviting the user for the storytelling, that like, in bringing more transparency, like start like breaking the ice like with like potential like users from like our data.
I love that. It's kind of like your earlier point too. It starts a conversation. It's not the final story, but it invites companies and folks to connect with you and learn more about their missions, maybe correct some data, but also do scenario planning.
Yeah.
How about you, Rahul? In terms of working with industry, how have maps been helpful?
Yeah, so I think it's important, I guess, to contextualize the industry that we're talking about with CarbonCure, which is the concrete industry. It's truly massive. Concrete is the second most abundant man-made material on the planet, behind purified drinking water. And it's a highly distributed industry. It's you can't really move the material more than say like 50 miles from its source to where it needs to be poured. So there are concrete plants all over the place. And it's been around forever. So this is like a huge behemoth of an industry that we are trying to change behavior for. And that can be quite difficult. So I liked the idea of sort of breaking the ice. We use maps in a very similar way there, where a lot of concrete producers, when we first approach them on the like our hardware sales side, they're skeptical. They have been pouring concrete. Concrete's been being poured since the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, the pharaohs. They've been doing it a certain way, and it's hard to introduce a new material, in this case CO2, into that. So there's questions about structural integrity, there's questions about cost, and all these different things. So when we can pull up a map and show you, hey, these are all the sites in your area that have been poured with CarbonCure concrete. These are the other producers in your area that are using CarbonCure concrete, or sorry, they're using our technology to create CarbonCure concrete. That really hits home for a lot of people. It can tend to be somewhat of a copycat industry, for better or for worse. And having those data points in a very visceral, like in your face way, it lands the punch like nothing else. So I guess it's sort of opening the conversation, but with a lot of the maps and the visuals there. But just in general, anything we can do to try to like shift people's behavior in this industry is helpful. And we've seen Matt, like our BD team uses our internal software is built off of Mapbox. So we integrate that into people's workflows when they're reaching out to producers to sell the technology.
Great. Well, I'm glad to hear that the mapping tools and the data visualizations are helping support those conversations. All right, I have one more question for the panel, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So folks, if you do have a question in mind for one or all of our panelists, please go ahead and use the Q&A box. But my final question for you all is about impact and action. Something that everyone who's watching this webinar can take away as a next step or a call to action. So could you share with us either a recommendation or a lesson learned from using maps in the way that you are for climate action? Or perhaps you've got some other call to action you would like folks to know about and go explore following this webinar. Maybe Riaz, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Climate change is big and scary, and the scope of what we still have left to accomplish can feel really intimidating, like so intimidating that it's easier to do nothing and just hope for the best, right? But I would encourage all organizations and companies, and more specifically, like the people behind them, right? The individuals working and representing at these places, down to the newest intern. Think about how you can incorporate nature positive action into your company standard operations. And often that just comes down to convincing some small number of key decision makers that sustainability is actually a smart business goal and it's worth doing. And maps and other visualizations are a really great way, as we've been discussing, to present climate impact data in a way that anyone, like non-scientists, can understand and appreciate. It could be easy for like the head of a company to dismiss some, far away, intangible, thing that's not related to like the school bus, that, down my block, as Rahul was saying, and be like, oh yeah, that's a far away thing. I'm not going to worry about it. But if you can show them a map and say, no, here, like, this is your factory and here are its emissions on this chart. And here's the river near the factory that you're polluting. And this is how far the trout population of that river has dipped since you started operations. This is the reduction in water quality. And these are the people who live in that area and are affected by it. That makes it real. And that, I think, helps make change.
Thanks, Riaz. Rahul.
Yeah, that was great. I second everything Riaz said. The climate challenge is massive and it's enormous. I think to push further on Riaz's point, engaging your local community, your company, your local governments and national governments. I think realizing that there are a lot of levers at our disposal and being willing to pull them or being willing to put pressure on folks to pull those levers for the right reasons is really important. In the concrete world specifically, like procurement policy is really important. So if we get the federal government to put in place some sort of standard that requires lower embodied carbon in concrete, that goes a long way and it trickles down and it changes that behavior honestly a lot faster than CarbonCure could do on its own. And again, maps are perfect for this because you can show people in your community, your local government leaders, like these are the places where this is happening. This building was built with a fraction of the carbon footprint of this building right across the street. Like, why is that? Why aren't we doing this across the board? So second everything Riaz says, and then trying to add a little bit more flavor. But
I like that. Yeah, there's the storytelling and even just informing your own operations, right? Using that data to drill in and get inspiration about different areas to target, maybe different partners to reach out to. Maybe I'm jumping ahead, Gabby, what would your call to action be for folks either using Climate Trace or in the climate space more generally?
I can say like a little bit like more like the climate space generally, as like the Riaz and Rahul like said, presenting the data like in a very like inviting way. It's one of the powerful things. One of the things that like we are learning like in Climate Trace is just like what is the exact like balance to present the data in a way that it communicates to the general public, but also it's going to communicate like to very like technical folks that it's not a very simple way. But not going too much like in technicalities like right away, because that can like give like the counter effect that you don't want. People are just going to look at that like I don't understand it, and then like not look at your data anymore. So that's like one of the things that I would say that like if folks are like more like for impact and climate action and want to like use maps more, like always like thinking about the balance of like how it is like the most like simple way, but also understanding and that it can communicate your story and your message. And also communicating your message in a way that you want like the desired impact, because there's a lot of like ways that you can do that and the user can interpret your data and do the opposite of what you were wishing for. So that's like one of like other like things that we were very careful and try to learn a lot. And if folks like I would just like invite like everyone like else like to check on like Climate Trace. We're always looking for feedback. If there's like any things that like you're not understanding or it's not clear, like just like contacting us on our contact form. And yeah, like we're open like for feedback.
Mm-hmm. And echoing your point too, Gabby, that there's so many tricky trade-offs when you're designing a map like this, right? The different audiences you're appealing to, different zoom levels, different things you're hoping people will do with the visualization and the data. I often, when talking with nonprofits, ask, does it have to be just one map? Can you make several different maps in thinking about some of CarbonCure and NCX's maps? You're creating multiple different versions for different audiences, different stories, so you can really kind of tailor in for a particular call to action or a particular audience, rather than trying to necessarily fit it just on one map. Great. Well, we've got some questions coming in the Q&A. So yeah, folks who are listening, if something's coming up for you, please do put it in the Q&A. Let me just look through our list here. On the theme of storytelling, Dominique asks, how do you attract users' attention into a story and data when an audience might have a short attention span these days? And so this is something to any of the panelists. What are some of your recommendations for catching people's attention?
I'm happy to go just really quickly go first, but I think one thing we learned in the first few iterations of some of our storytelling materials that we did is trying to keep it concise. We can get lost in the sauce pretty quickly, and there's a lot going on, so you want to provide all this detail, but folks aren't always there to read all of it. I would also suggest sprinkling in different forms of multimedia. So I think NCX does a great job of this. NCX does a perfect job of this on the stuff that you showed, where you have a bunch of different things to draw the attention and draw the eye. And we try to put in videos and some other things like that. So.
Yeah, I'd echo what Rahul said here. I think we've found that it's easy to go overboard. And so you have to make sure you consciously rein yourself in, because there's so much data you want to present. It's like, look, the evidence is all here. I want to show you everything. But you really have to pay attention to people's short attention span and make sure that you kind of draw them in slowly. So maybe start with, very narrow view or a single video, single image, single set of images, and then slowly kind of draw them in further and further along. So one of our earlier incarnations of the Impact Dashboard, we did a little focus group, and we had someone looking at it live with us, and they're like, yeah, that's really pretty. It looks great. I have no idea what's going on. And it's just, there's just so much there that we were trying to put into a single map, as you were saying, Marina, right? Like it was a clear case where things should have been broken up into different places, but we tried to put so much into one place. And it was having the opposite effect, as Gabby was saying, right? It was like information overload, and it's like, all right, I don't even want to engage with this anymore. So I think the lesson that we've learned is kind of paring it back a little bit really goes a long way. And now, like our scrollies, the engagement on these pages is crazy. It's like minutes long, which is really great.
Nice. Yeah, you're effectively drawing people into that story. Yeah. Anything you'd like to add, Gabby?
I think that they touch base like a lot of that. But yeah, like I would say that sometimes less is more. Like that's the main thing. Like presenting the data or presenting the thing that you're gonna raise questions and trigger the curious part of the user. It's one of the key things that we think about. And it's just you showed this, and then you can build up the story slowly to kind of if you have a user interface, what if I click here, what is going to happen? And then the data changes. So it's kind of thinking about more the presenting the data that it's going to create questions. And then you're the next step, you're trying to predict the question. And then you can answer with the new interaction and deep doing more a deep dive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to continue this conversation. We've got a couple questions I'm going to combine about using Zoom levels creatively to help people, start at one level of the data and then get more granular, get into closer resolutions with the data. Any thoughts on using Zoom as effectively in your maps?
I can kick off on that one. That is one of the things that we started in Climate Trace, mapping the assets, the individual sources. And all the reason for that was just being as granular as we can be, so then we can aggregate it up. So right now, one of the things that we're doing, we present the data first on the country level, our emissions inventories on the country level. And then once you're in that country, and that's one iteration that we're going to do, spoiler alert, once you're in that country, you can see all the emission sources in that country, as I showed there, but you can aggregate them in a state level. And then if that, it kind of covers a lot of our use cases layers, because there are some users that are interested in country totals. There are users that are interested in the state total. So then you zoom into that state, you're not looking anything else anymore. And then there are some users that are even interested in the county level. So then you just go and then you deep dive even more in that. And And then you can also like filter based on like what type of like class of the data that you're seeing, like for different like sectors. So that's like how like we were kind of like using Zoom right now, starting like with the big picture, like the country totals, and then like deep diving in more like analysis for like further in the data.
Nice. I'm going to combine a couple other questions. I know we're just about at time, but Janet from Tanzania has put a number of different questions in. So looking at CarbonCure and NCX, any thoughts on working internationally? NCX, are you planning on expanding outside of the US? Or Rahul, do you do any work in Tanzania or similar countries?
Yeah, I can go first. Obviously, climate change is a global problem. Forests grow all over the globe as well, and forests are our thing at NCX. It's something we've thought about. Right now, we've built up a US based landowner base that we've been working with, and so right now that is our focus. It's just remain in the US.
Yeah, so we're actually on all continents. To varying degrees. Our primary focus is also the US and Canada. We're a Canadian company, actually. I should have mentioned that at the outset. I don't know off the top of my head if we have any, like, I'm trying to find it right now, but any facilities specifically in Tanzania, but that we totally are open to that. Concrete is very different, like on a more granular level, but on a high level, it's the same sort of base process that's happening everywhere, and our technology is applicable to most conditions. So look us up.
Great. All right. If you don't mind, panelists, just a couple other short questions from folks. Seeing great engagement here. Jamil asks, I believe to Gabby, any recommendations on data that you've found difficult to find, that's missing or underrepresented currently?
That's like a very I would say that like there are a lot of like data that goes like in our models, like data inputs that like they are hard like to find. For instance, like we use electricity generation data from like different power plants to either like drive like to train our AI and ML models, and to find that data, like we had to go like to each country reporting like electricity generation, and that will like required a lot of like heads down like research, like looking for like what are like the electricity grid for like that specific country, like what are like the emissions data or what there are. In other part as well, there are locations data like from emission sources that are like there's no like comprehensive like database that has like those locations. So right now, one example is like feedlots, so like farms for animals, and we are using like AI and ML to train like our models to find where like those feedlots they are located across the world. So we're building like our map ourselves, but mostly because we try to find some data and we couldn't, and now like we're like training models to find them.
Great. All right, and one more question for Riaz. This is a little bit more generally about forest-based carbon credits, but how does NCX address some of the more pressing criticisms about forest carbon credits, such as additionality, permanence, leakage, and data transparency? Anything you'd like to share on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question that our science team spends a whole lot more time thinking about than I do in engineering. And each one of those points, could fill a whole session by itself. There's papers and literature on each of these things. I would refer folks who are interested in this in our position to the Learning Hub at ncx.com, or follow us on social media to kind of better understand our position there. What I will say about data transparency, though, is that it is critical across the sector to improving trust in carbon markets and just climate action and kind of what people are trying to do in general. And it's a big part of the culture at NCX. For forest carbon especially, there have been a lot of recent headlines around poor results from some of the earlier carbon projects, and that's having this effect of companies are freezing, and it's causing hesitation in the market when we really need action now more than ever. And maps again are key to helping provide that transparency to people and make that data more accessible. So if we can increase that trust in the data and increase transparency, then we can increase the speed and the scale of action that we need.
what a great note to end on as well, in terms of that. That's my big takeaway from this conversation today, is about maps as a way to start that conversation and build trust and build understanding between folks. So just any closing thoughts you'd like to add, Rahul or Gabby?
No, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining and participating as well. Thanks, like Marina, for organizing.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you everyone who joined live. For folks who are watching the recording afterwards, thank you for your questions. And a big thank you to our three speakers. Thank you for joining us today and for the work that you do and these very impactful maps and data work that you're doing every day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.